Okay, so hi Louis, nice to meet you.
Hi.
Can you tell us why you've written your book and why now?
Sure. So I wrote this book because I became a dad 6 years ago, and I have been working with children for over 20 years. I'm trained as a child psychotherapist, and I've seen quite a lot of things changing in the world that made me worried, not just about my own daughter, but also about the children who I see and work with.
Mm.
Things including like, just the acceleration of digital technology and the harms associated with that, the climate crisis, and like I started to worry about the possible future that my daughter would be facing. There was all these kind of trends, and then there was obviously the rise, which is quite well documented in research now, of mental health problems amongst children and young people, especially young people. So all of this was making me feel worried, and I really wanted actually just to try and think about what's going on here. Why are we seeing this rise in children's mental health problems? And what can we do about it? And I felt there was a lot of stuff that was very focused on treating the symptoms out there in the world. There's all a million and one different types of treatments and technologies and CBTs and DBTs and all of this, mostly focused on treating the symptoms. But I didn't see or find anything that was actually thinking about what the root causes were. So that was the reason. There was like both a personal and a professional reason for writing this book, is figuring out what's going on that's making our children mad. And by mad, I have this double meaning of both, talking about the mental health crisis, but also talking about how children seem to be, well, young people seem to be getting more and more angry. At the time I wrote it, there was a sort of Extinction Rebellion movement, and so many young people were taking to the streets protesting, and I still think that sense and that energy is there. So it was just like trying to understand what's going on and try and think of and come up with some solutions that can guide. Basically, it's for adults, grown-ups, parents, carers, teachers,
Mhm.
child therapists, anyone who works with or cares about children, trying to give them a guide of how to navigate what feels like a very tumultuous world, and how to hopefully raise children who feel empowered and compassionate and hopefully can become like the leaders of a better tomorrow. That's how I would sort of put it.
Mm. Ambitious.
Yes, just a small
Just a
task.
small task.
Yeah.
But so the root cause and the book focuses a lot on parents. So why have you
Yes.
chosen to focus so much on the parental impact and actually on parents' mental health?
Yeah, well, I have this line in the book, which is that parents are the filter through which their children experience the world. So, um, for example, I worked with a Iraqi lady who grew up when there were bombs falling down in her city in Iraq. And one of the things that she told me, which really struck me, was that the trauma for her was not the fact that there were bombs falling around her, but it was the fact that her parents were pretending like everything was okay, but she could see in their faces and in their behavior that it absolutely wasn't okay. And the
Mm.
sort of dissonance and the incongruence that she was experiencing created this really difficult, like, internal experience for her. So that's just like one
Mm.
concrete example of how parents are the filter for their children's experience. And in my practice, which is my therapy work, which has evolved over the years, I started off trained very much in child-centered approach. I've worked loads with children in different capacities, very focused on the children. But I also started to realize that actually, a child who you might see in therapy for 50 minutes a week goes back
Mm.
to the family and the parents where there may be still ongoing issues. So I started to realize that I could have more impact by focusing on the parents and trying to help the parents heal their own wounds
Mm.
so they don't pass them on to their children.
Mm. Yeah. And how might a parent's unresolved trauma show up in their child's behavior or in their child's distress? How does that happen?
Yeah, well, I there are some things that I really don't know how to explain, but have seen things happen enough times that I'm quite clear that this something is going on here. So one thing that I talk about in the book is how typically in a if I'm working with a parent, like a parent might come to me and say, I'm worried about my child who's experiencing X, Y, or Z. And when we inquire into it, very often the age at which the child is experiencing some issues is the same age that the parent has had some unresolved trauma, whether their parents got divorced, somebody died, something bad happened. So I've noticed that as a pattern, and I started to sort of see how, um, yes, and something it's very hard to explain scientifically. Maybe somebody out there has figured that out, but I haven't. But I definitely noticed that it almost is like when the children present these symptoms in a family, it's really what those symptoms are trying to achieve. And I think this is a helpful way of looking at it, is they're trying to heal some unresolved trauma in the family system. And it's helpful to see the symptoms in that way. So symptoms, whether it's anxiety, depression, self-harm, whatever it is, they're trying to achieve something. There is some kind of intelligence or wisdom in the symptoms. And
Mm.
it's only if the parents are willing to see the possibility of that and look at themselves that that healing can happen. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So it's shifting to see behavior as a communication rather than,
Exactly.
but as
Exactly.
you
Which
say,
is just a much more compassionate way of looking at it anyway, because as soon as you start addressing symptoms as like there's something wrong with the child, you're creating an identity around it that's based on shame and pathologizing.
mm,
Like I've written about and spoken about before, the dominant mental health narrative that is prevalent, as far as I can tell, is really that if you experience something like anxiety or depression, there's something wrong with your brain.
mm,
Yeah, your brain is broken and therefore your brain needs fixing. Now, obviously, there might be some truth to the fact that, there is some chemical things going on in people's brains that lead them to feel certain things and behave in a certain way. But we also know that there's certain things that anyone can do to change the chemistry in their brain and the body. We
mm,
also know that the environment, which includes like the family, what you're exposed to through social media, schools, all of that influences the chemistry in the brain. So I just found that the dominant narrative that says, "Oh, you've got depression, take these pills and that'll sort it all out," is just it's excluding so much else that could actually be even more helpful.
mm. I feel like this next question is related to that kind of slightly mysterious thing, but you liken children to canaries in the coal mine. I mean, can
Yes.
you tell us what you mean by that?
Yeah, well, children are sensitive to the world around them. So one of the what I love discovering about the original story of the canaries in the coal mine, I didn't really know where that phrase came from, but then I just looked into it, and essentially canaries. Somebody discovered that canaries were the one bird that's particularly sensitive to the toxic gases that could come up in coal mines and that would present a risk to the miners.
Mhm.
And so a canary in a coal mine, people sent canaries into coal mines because they would detect these toxic gases. And basically, if a canary went into a coal mine and died, that was a sign that the miners needed to get out.
Mm,
So similarly with children and what we're seeing in the child mental health crisis, children's brains are very sensitive to the world around them. They haven't developed like loads of defenses, psychological defensive strategies, ways of protecting themselves. So they are picking up and absorbing from the environment, even if they're not exposed to online content and social media and all the harmful content that can be exposed to online. They're picking up from their parents. They're picking up signals from their teachers, from just all around them. And so when we see our children suffering with like increased levels of anxiety and depression and self-harm and suicide, really that's just canaries who are sensitive to the toxic gases in our culture, giving us a really strong signal that something is not right. that we need to do something about. So I'm really trying to present the mental health crisis in children as like a wake-up call, rather than to say like what you tend to find in typical media reporting is like shocking statistics. Oh gosh, there's been a significant rise in suicide amongst young people, and but then there's very little careful thought and reflection about why that is happening, and it's very often just more like sort of panic driven. That's what I notice anyway in the media. So I really wanted to frame the child mental health crisis in what I hope is like an empowering way, like a wake up call. It's like some of the things about our culture are toxic and not helping. And it's not just, I mean, the obvious thing that is there's a lot of chat about this at the moment with there's a book come out by Jonathan Haidt, which is called The Anxious Generation, which is he's making a very strong case for social media being the primary cause for the child mental health crisis, which I think there is some truth about that. But I'm more interested in why we're so hooked on these things like social media. What are the deeper root factors that make social media so appealing to us? And in the book, I explore that through a few different angles, like narcissism and why we like crave to be seen and to be loved and to be admired and accepted and respected. And what if the adults could actually take care of that need in themselves a bit more, like really acknowledging the fact that everyone wants to be loved. Like I have a quote from Stone Roses, which was one of my favorite bands growing up, whose song I Want to Be Adored. It's quite a dark song about that craving to be adored, but I think everyone has that. Everyone wants to be adored. There's a part of them just wants that adulation. But I think there's a really healthy way that we can look inside ourselves as grown-ups and parents and take care of those needs in a way that will allow our children to thrive better.
In terms of society at large, I mean, is there something that's gone wrong in terms of our relationship to our emotions and our suffering? Is there a case of kind of hypervigilance that isn't serving our children?
Yes, well, I really worry about the sort of what I've called in the book mental health awareness gone wrong. Like there's a lot of really good stuff about mental health awareness, just raising awareness of these issues that are very important. But what happens when mental health awareness meets the algorithms and social media is it just runs like wildfire. So for example, there was an amazing, shocking story. I think it was at the start of the pandemic where there was a TikTok influencer, a girl who had Tourette's, and she had several million followers, and she'd started to post videos of herself in the classroom that she was secretly recording herself having tics, and her videos were getting millions and millions of views. Largely, I believe, were young people watching it who were so fascinated and curious by this, like, direct insight into this person's life. And what happened is there was a rise in referrals to clinics for young people with Tourette's. Now, you could say, oh, that's great. More young people are recognizing that they've got a problem. But actually, the Great Ormond Street Hospital, the group of pediatricians there wrote a letter because they were so concerned. The number of young people who were coming to their clinic who were convinced that they had tics, but it was mostly just what they'd convinced themselves to believe that they had, having watched this video. And I think with social media, what we forget is the immediacy of the content. It really sends so many signals directly into our brains and our nervous systems, and we can get easily convinced of things. So bringing it to the sort of point about hypervigilance. Hypervigilance is a term that's used often to describe one of the symptoms that people experience after a traumatic event. It basically means it's kind of like the meerkats, where you're like standing on your hind legs and anxiously scanning the environment to see if there's any threats. which is a natural response if you've experienced a traumatic event, that your nervous system is activating. You're anxiously scanning to see if you're safe or not. But that hypervigilance can also be directed internally towards our internal states. So if you're seeing videos of people talking about their depression, their anxiety, and if you're told statistics like 1 in 4 young girls will experience depression, and it's being drilled in repeatedly because these videos really, for some reason, do seem to do well on the algorithms of social media, then as a young person, you're going to be anxiously scanning your internal environment to see if there's something wrong with you. And the thing with mental health is, to some extent, it's subjective. So if you're scanning, looking for signs that there's something wrong with you, you can almost guarantee that you will find them. And the example I use in the book is comparing it to COVID, when we were all hyper vigilant about coughs. And if you had like the slightest tickliest throat, you would be convinced that you must have COVID. So a similar thing, I think, goes on with hypervigilance around mental health symptoms. And that's not the only reason, but that's one of the things that I think is leading to such an escalation in diagnosis.
Mm, yeah, it's really I mean, it's kind of heartbreaking, all of that information that they're receiving and then looking for something wrong within themselves. And
I know. With that, I think the key thing is that there's so much information being received online that, and there's just nowhere near enough space to process
mm,
and digest those things. So
mm,
I could have, like, with a young client, I could have like several sessions, like hours, really trying to understand like what's going on. Let's think about the symptoms you're experiencing and how you're relating to them, and let's try and like really dig deep into what the actual issue is. Now, I'm not definitely not saying everybody needs to see a therapist, because I don't think that's right, but it's this imbalance between the bombardment of content and information and just the lack of space to process and digest it.
yeah. I feel like there's a general discourse that kids are like less resilient today. And when you describe that situation, it strikes me that even if that is true, that they're that you can hardly blame them. But do you think there's any truth to that idea that kids are less resilient today than they used to be? And do you think there's an issue of parenting styles, overprotective parenting? Do those two things come hand in hand or not really?
Well, firstly, to say, obviously, I would never sort of describe kids in general, because that's such a Daily Mail kind of
Of
statement,
course, yeah,
isn't it?
of course.
But I would say, and I do talk about it in the book, there's definitely been a demographic sociological shift. So in, most Western countries, people are having less children. And so you're getting more of these sort of beanpole families, whereas you might have 1 or 2 children, whereas a generation or 2 generations ago, it might be more common to have 3 or 4. And because of that shift, what you're finding is you've got more parental resource going into that 1 or 2, like, very precious children. Like, children become more precious the less they are. And my favorite example of this is when we were living in London, we lived next door to a Hasidic Jewish family. And by the time we left, they had 8 children. And my daughter really used to want to go and play next door, but we were absolutely terrified because there was literally zero supervision. Because how can you supervise 8 children effectively? And we used to see them like hanging out the window, like 4-year-olds hanging out the window. So that was just a really clear comparison of the difference. When you've got less children or you've got 1 children, you really spend more time on them and you can like really worry about them more. But then they don't learn to figure things out for themselves. And there is research that shows that helicopter parenting and overprotective parenting can lead to worst outcomes, mental health outcomes for children.
Mm.
So I have a chapter in the book about empowerment and basically what are some good strategies that parents can use to empower their children. And really, it's simply about letting them have more unsupervised play, not interfering, not like rushing in to try and fix things if they're struggling with something, and really just trusting that they can figure things out for themselves, just if you give them just enough space. And it is difficult to do that as parents, because if you see a child suffering, you just want to swoop in and make it better for them. And I think that's particularly true with emotions. So, families are all different, but I definitely have seen this in our family, and I'm even trying to correct it in myself, where we see our child crying, and you really just want to make it better. Whatever you can do to make it better, like let's watch something, let's have something sweet, I mean, I'm pretty sure, and I've seen, this is a common thing that parents do. It might not be those same strategies, but you just want to make it better quickly. And we want to make it better because when we see someone, our child suffering like that, we really find it difficult to just tolerate and trust that they will actually be okay. So what I've been doing more and more with my own daughter, and I do try and teach this as well, trying to teach what I preach. Now that's not the right saying, is it? I'm just trying to practice what I preach. Yeah. Is when she's upset, really just being okay with that, not trying to fix it, not trying to make it better, but just really saying it's so okay. It's okay to be sad, or it's okay to be angry, and just giving her the space. And you can only really do that if you can just find a place in yourself where you just trust that they will be okay.
Yeah, I can imagine difficult in your own kind of home environment, and I can imagine that becomes more difficult when you're around other parents. I have
Yes,
friends who I
absolutely.
have friends who've entered the parenting, life, and
Yeah.
I'm amazed by the pressure that they feel from other
There's
parents.
so
Mm.
much pressure, and it's really good to be aware of that.
Yeah.
Just to notice that when you're with other parents or in a social setting, that your response to your child's emotions is being shaped by what you perceive other people will be thinking about you. So you're really shaping your parenting based on other people's judgments. And we just have to be careful that we don't want our parenting to be determined by other people's judgments, especially if those judgments aren't necessarily helpful or healthy. So particularly with feelings, like I really it's so obvious to say, I know, but just it's very important that we teach our children that it's okay to have feelings. Yeah, and really we really don't want to pathologize feelings because feelings are just normal part of the human experience. It's a natural response from our bodies. It's evolution doing its thing. Like there's different reasons for different feelings, but to sort of try and shut them up because we're worried about people's judgments is teaching the children some unhealthy strategies.
Yeah. And what about I hear a lot about gentle parenting. What's your take on that? Do you know what it is?
I do know of it. I've never really looked into it, but I know some of my friends are massive believers in it. The only thing that I would say that I notice in a lot of attachment style parenting stuff, and this may be similar, is the parents are like running around sacrificing all their own needs for their children. And I think it's so important that parents remember that they need to look after themselves and honor their own needs too, and that the children will be fine if they're not like tending to them and responding to their every need like 24 hours a day.
And so what is it that you would say if you had to sum it up nice and neatly? What is it that
Mhm.
children really need from their parents in your experience?
What they need from their parents is a strong, steady, loving presence, and particularly to find some place inside themselves where you can trust that your children have some inner capacities that they can figure things out. Really, just finding that trust, I think, is so important.
Yeah. And just one last question from me. I mean, your book is about, the root issues that we're seeing play out on the larger scale of society, but you are always asking people to look inwards. And I'm
Yes.
wondering what you would say to people who are skeptical that tending to themselves can make any difference in a world that they feel frustrated or upset by.
Oh, I love that question. Thank you for asking that. Well, um, you know, who we are and how we show up in the world has a ripple effect. Like how you show up to the person on the counter at the supermarket, how you show up to the other parent at the playground, how you show up in the morning when you get up to your partner or to your child, to whatever it is. All of these little micro moments in the day have ripple effects, and we can't compute those ripple effects, but I know that that's true. And so the only way to sort of try and bring our best selves into our lives is to have that ripple effect to our children and through our children out into the world, is to really tend to what's going on for us internally. I mean, I think it's just logical and obvious. And I think what happens is a lot of people have, and I think this is predominant in Western culture mostly, but a lot of people have developed all sorts of irrational fears about what it means to like just turn their attention inwardly and tune into what's going on inside. They're scared about what they'll find, or that if they've got a feeling that they have fears that they'll be overwhelmed by it. But if we can just learn to bring a bit more gentle, tender compassion to ourselves, I know for sure that that can ripple out through our children out into the world.
Mm. Thank you so much, Louis. It's a great book. So
Thank you.
we'll get lots from it. Thank
Thank
you
you
very
very
much.
much.